Welcome, Roger.
Děkuji.
Prosím.
Dobrý den, kolego. Promiňte, mluvím česky jenom to. Tak dnes mluvím anglicky. Good afternoon. As Kak has told you, I'm going to be here for a couple of months, and later in this talk, I will tell you what my purpose here is as I see it, and how you can help me achieve that purpose. What I'm going to do today is reflect on ecology animal ecology, mostly as how I have experienced it. I first became thought of myself as an ecologist as opposed to a zoologist or an entomologist in 1966. So this is a long time. And during that time, I've always had a very broad interest. I have watched the development of our subject, sometimes forwards, sometimes backwards. And I'm going to pick on a few issues that have struck me. And I'm going to explain it to you in terms of my career. I'm sorry, this is egotistical, but I'm not in the business of collecting new data now, so it's more important to reflect. But I think it's very important for students as well to reflect. You necessarily are very narrowly focused on your project. You want to get a degree. You must get a degree, otherwise nobody will listen to you. Or more important, pay you. But it is important, and I have thought this from the very beginning of my time as an ecologist, that you think more broadly. Now, no.
More right now.
We point up there, maybe?
The receiver should be in
The
the.
receiver is in here. It just doesn't work. Sorry.
It worked a moment ago.
Yeah,
We tried it.
we tried it and it's not doing anything.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
Good. So just to start at the beginning, or not quite the beginning, I was a graduate in zoology, botany, and then specializing in entomology at Imperial College back in the 60s. But I then made the important decision to change universities, and I went to the University of Oxford to the Bureau of Animal Population. So these three universities, Imperial College, Oxford, and the University of British Columbia in Canada, where I was a postdoc, were very important in forming how I have approached the world ever since. Why? Well, early on it was because of mentors. Maybe mentor is the wrong word. A mentor is somebody who goes out of the way to help you and instruct you. It's different from a teacher. It's somebody who says, I actually like you or you, and I'm going to use my knowledge, wisdom sometimes, and influence to help you. And you don't really know until afterwards, who has been most important. I was the very last student of Charles Elton. Now, you ought to know that name. Charles Elton has been called the father of animal ecology. But if you have ever thought about food chains, or ecological niches, or the pyramid of numbers in ecosystems, or trophic levels, invasion ecology, the classification of habitats, all of those originated in Elton's 1926 book on animal ecology, which is still in print and is still worth reading. Elton was a synthesizer. He wasn't much of a mathematician, although he acknowledged the importance of numerical approaches. He was a naturalist, and he was a very quiet man. I walked into the coffee room one day, because morning tea was a big deal, and I sat down, and there was just him and me for a few minutes. And he said, Roger, he said, what do you do for exercise? And I said, well, I played a little squash. And he said, you know, I used to box. I knocked a man out once. And that was how he spoke. But as someone who spent his entire life thinking about how what we now call ecosystems work, and his wide view is very important. The other chap who was significant, particularly in my career later on, was this guy, Richard Southwood, Dick Southwood, as he was called. He was one of my undergraduate professors. Well, he wasn't a professor at the time. He was a reader, associate professor. But later, he became important. But again, now he was very much an entomologist. He collected and sorted and did all that sort of stuff. He did a lot of early work on the taxonomy of Heteroptera. But always, or perhaps later, he thought in terms of generalizations. And his presidential address to the British Ecological Society about 1977 on a thing called the Habitat Template, where he made effectively a diagrammatic model of the world, certainly had a big impact on me. From there, I went to British Columbia. Now this, from Oxford to British Columbia, was a bit like, well, it was a change of life, shall we say. And I worked with this guy, Buzz Holling. You may have heard of him. You should have heard of him, especially if you're interested in predation, because he built the first set of models. Not the first, it wasn't the first. An entirely new approach, a behavioral ecological approach, if you like, to the process of predation. But the point about his group in BC was that it was very quantitative. And I spent a lot of time there sitting in on courses trying to make up for the lack of quantitative training I'd had previously. But he called his approach to predation component modeling. We can talk about it at length. I wrote a book about it once. He invented or borrowed the term resilience into ecology. He said we shouldn't be too much concerned about whether the systems we're looking at converge on a stable point, which they almost never do, but what are the limits of disturbance that systems can put up with, both naturally and artificially. And he went on, the thing I learned from him was that as an ecologist, as a biologist, you can and should also engage with the civil process of environmental management and the politics of ecology, whether you want to or not. Not when you're doing a PhD, guys, but down the track. So those three guys were very, very important to me and have remained so for the past 50 years. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to divide the rest of this talk into three bits. 2 points, which are take-home messages for students, and finally to tell you about what I'm doing here. So point one is that regardless of your specific project, obviously you have a defined project. We all work in defined projects. Funding is blocked into defined projects, and clearly you've got to focus on those, you've got to come up with results, you've got to present data, and you add one more tiny building block to our picture of the world. That's important. You won't survive if you don't do that. But there is always a big picture. And if somebody says to you, and it can happen, believe me, in a PhD exam, what are the general implications of your results? How do they fit into the wider world? Even if the wider world is just the science of ecology, then you'd better have thought about that. So that's point one. So let me try and illustrate that. I began, once I'd finished all that education stuff, I got a real job. I was recruited to go to Australia to work in a very entomological milieu, very entomological environment, and studying this little animal, the sheep blowfly, which was is a pest of sheep, and sheep are pretty important in Australia and New Zealand economically. I had a couple more mentors there who nobody has ever heard of, and you can tell I couldn't even find a picture of either of them on the web in preparing this talk, which is rather sad. A guy called Dick Hughes, who in his time was probably the leading population ecologist of insects, and Peter Geyer, who was also a population ecologist. And so what I was doing there for 5 years was what most people trained as entomologists do. You're employed by some government or semi-government department. You're told, fix this problem, and this problem is species 1 or species 2 or species 3. If you're lucky, there are some predators and parasites involved. If not, it's all about what we used to call horticology. So in terms of developing an ecological expertise, it's about it's all about mortality, it's all about natality, it's about dispersal, it's about age structure. These are population quantities. And for a long time, if I may jump ahead to what I'll say in a few minutes, that was mainly what animal ecology was all about. Plant ecologists dealt with communities, although they didn't, of course. They dealt with plant assemblages, which are an important but only part of any community. But I think because of the Eltonian background I had absorbed, I found this a very unsatisfactory way of doing things. However, I did try and look for generalities, produced a paper that's reasonably popular at the end of that period. But I have to say that traditional autoecological approach I found, for me, and this is all personal stuff I'm talking about, it was a rather sterile way of looking at the natural world. So I left. Never be afraid to leave a job, but it's better if you've got one lined up to go to before you leave. Storming out in a huff is fine if you've got lots of money, but so in the mid-1970s in Australia, as in many other parts of the world, there was a whole raft of new universities founded, and they were all looking for new staff. And I was fortunate enough to go to Griffith University, or be employed by Griffith University, and I worked there on and off ever since. There's a short period at another university in the middle. I might add, when I first joined the university, there were 2 buildings. That's a recent version, and it's growing all the time. It now has 50,000 students. It was designed originally, conceptually, to have 8,000, but politics overcame it. But because of the ethos, because of the approach that that university took, I was landed into a school of environmental studies. It lately transmuted into environmental sciences and then into natural and environmental sciences. But nobody knew what environmental studies was. In fact, we spent a lot of fruitless time arguing about what is this thing, environmental studies. And to cut a long story short, what the very active group of ecologists who were employed there, including myself, did, we made it mean lots of ecology and other stuff as well. It was interesting to be not in a department, having come from zoology departments and botany departments and all the rest of it, suddenly to find yourself with a mathematician in the office next door and a sociologist 2 doors down and a psychologist, for heaven's sake, 4 doors down, was interesting. So we created, this was the first environmental studies school in the country, and it was a very exciting thing, very frustrating at times. Okay, so now let's talk about the research. Initially, being imbued with population theory, I thought, okay, we'll do population stuff, and I get PhD students and postdocs to help me, but we'll do it on stuff that I'm actually interested in, instead of these rotten little flies that live in the backsides of sheep. So for a long time, we focused on butterflies. You know, entomologists start collecting butterflies. I did when I was 13, and that passion never leaves you. And I had a whole bunch of students, and we were able to assign each of them a particular species that was common, and they did all the usual stuff about mortality, natality, dispersion. Perhaps of most interest and most long-lasting impact was the work that my first postdoc, Nomi Pierce, now at Harvard, did on this little guy, which is Gelminus evagarus. And why was that particularly interesting? Because it's one of the Thecline lycinids that have intimate mutualistic associations with those rotten little creatures, the ants. Anyway, anybody who wants to talk to me about butterflies, make sure you have a lot of time, because I love to talk about them. But over the years, again, I collated all those student projects and tried to look at generalities, either in biogeography. Sorry about this, but it was the only picture I could find of our work on the web, so I did have permission to reproduce it because it's our map. We produced a handbook eventually, of course, and a compendium. So again, trying to say, what does having 6 or 8 or 10 studies of butterflies mean in general? Syntheses. My second research topic had been my PhD thesis in Oxford was on tree holes. It's become a very big industry studying water-filled tree holes, I'm happy to say. But it all started in the English-speaking world anyway, in Whiteton Woods, with things like this in the roots of beeches. And that whole thing developed into studies of the whole class, wonderful, interesting work we did over the years on pitcher plants, on leaf axils. I think that's in Dipsacus, in bamboo stems, and I haven't worked on bromeliads, but there is a large band of people who look at that. And that work continued in the background for decades. And resulted in what I think actually is probably my only seminal contribution to the literature, which is this whopping great book in which I took our work on phytoterms and everybody else's, and I mean literally everybody who'd ever worked on them up to that point. I missed 1 or 2 who were quick to tell me so once the book came out, but in the event, it's 400 or 500 references on phytoterm studies. This work came out in 2010, and is still going strong, maybe before that. Anyway, never mind, it worked well. But again, it was looking across studies and seeing what are the generalities. And I constructed a template in the Southwood fashion of the spatial and temporal processes which determine what organisms you're going to find in each of these habitats across the world. I was casually in Wojciech's office yesterday reading this wonderful book by John Lawton on problems and progress in community ecology, one of these little volumes written by people who have won some grand prize. And he says only in these habitats is anybody ever actually studying a community. The rest of us study assemblages. Modeling the movement process, a hangover from my time with Holling. I didn't actually, and I'm not going to go into this, I'll speed up a bit now. But again, what you do when you get bored of sitting there on a computer, well, you go back to biology, but slipping in between, I wrote a book about modeling, which did well for a while. But living in Brisbane, the nearest rainforest, subtropical rainforest, is a mere half hour's drive away. And it called to me as a naturalist. And so a whole bunch of research areas developed, one of which was the canopy. Initially, with one of my very early students, Yves Basset, he was climbing on ropes to get into the canopy. As you all know so well now, we have these wonderful things called cranes. I have a whole lecture on how the crane phenomenon developed that you might like to hear at some stage. We didn't have the first crane. In Australia, it was the fourth or fifth, but we did start the whole movement, if you wish, that has led to how many cranes are there now? 20, 25 around the world, something like that. And of course, once you can access the canopy comfortably without having to be an athlete or a monkey, then you can do all sorts of wonderful things on processes. Lots and lots of rainforest PhD students over the years, right through to my retirement, not all looking at the canopy, but certainly looking at rainforest phenomena. Again, I won't dwell on that, but that's the whole of canopy science in one diagram that we prepared for a review. But, and this is my important point, once again, having worked on canopy fogging and what the biodiversity of beetles was in the canopy and all that sort of stuff, you look to synthesize, to try and pull that together and say, what are the general points? And we had particularly useful reviews in Science and in Trees, sort of 20 years apart. You're all familiar with this, that we compiled with most compilations, most books that are compilations, edited volumes, sink like stones after about 3 years. This is the exception. It still does well. And this is a more popular version of one particular rainforest. Then I got into elevational gradients and turnover and fragmentation, mainly working on moths. I'm not going to dwell on that. This was the seminar I gave here in 2015, so you will all remember that. So I'm sure some of you might. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that, but it did turn out that this was, as you know, because some of you are engaged in similar things in PNG and elsewhere, it's a very powerful tool for looking at what's driving change in assemblages of particular groups of insects, birds, plants, what have you, if you can use nature as an experimenter. Again, lots of compilations on this have emerged. Okay, so the take-home message, point one, always know the wider context of your project. Where does your work fit in current ecological theory, which you should at least be trying to keep abreast of in the broadest sense. Doesn't mean you need to work out what all those horrible partial differential equations mean. You don't, but you have to know what the general questions are and what the conclusions are. Beware, there's a great temptation among some ecologists to say there can't be generalizations, that every system is different. Well, every system is different because it's made up of different sets of species with different evolutionary and biogeographic histories, but doesn't mean there aren't generalizations. Just means the generalizations may be complex. Don't expect simple generalizations. I'll come back to that in a minute. And remember this thing, contingency. What you see now is the product of all sorts of factors which constrain, which set limits on what you can see now. Okay, point two is there are fashions in ecology. Often, but not always, driven by new technologies. And please try and remember that these new technologies and these fashions are all tools. And please remember that ecology, your subject, is part of biology. And the important thing is to ask good biological questions and then use whichever of these methods is appropriate. So I'm going to flash through a few of them, which have crossed my path. I am not a historian of science. So what I'm saying are my prejudices and my experience. And remember, ecology is a very old subject. Haeckel may have invented the word in 1866, but usually people like Theophrastus in the 1st century or something like that are thought of as the first people to talk about organisms in relation to their environment. It all became very formal with Humboldt and Warming and people like that, like so many things, very strong Germanic beginning, completely overtaken by the Anglophones, I'm afraid, subsequently. Okay, so as a population ecologist, and in the early days of my time as an ecologist, a research ecologist, reductionist models it was generally thought that if we were only smart enough, there'd be 2 or 3 equations, m equals c x squared or whatever. No, that's island biogeography. There'd be a few equals mc squared. That's what I'm trying to say. God bless you, Einstein. That if we're really smart enough, there'd be a few equations like that, which would basically sort it all out. Now, you could argue that in population ecology, especially in simplified systems, to some extent that's true. Locke, Volterra, MacArthur, and our old friend Bob May subsequently certainly dwelt on that and got a huge amount of mileage, which we all need to know about. But it turns out once you start talking about multiple species systems, and almost all, well, certainly all natural systems are multiple species systems, there's nowhere to go. There was a brief time in the 70s when Pym and Lawton started building vast arrays of Lockyer-Volterra models and calling them food webs, that we thought that would work. But it turned out, again, the world was too complex. However, you still need to know about these things. You certainly, if you ever teach ecology, as many of you will, you certainly need to include this stuff in there. But in my view, any general view of ecology is not going to be a reductionist one. It's going to be synthetic and it's going to be complex. Related to that, the biggest debate when I was an undergraduate was how are populations regulated? You know, the argument was that natural populations do exist within certain ranges, minimum numbers, maximum numbers. We now know that's probably not a good generalization. But was that because they were controlled by environmental conditions, as our Australian colleagues Andrew Arthur and Birch said, or were they controlled by density dependence, either direct or inverse density dependence, which this guy, A.J. Nicholson, who alone among all these guys never wrote a book, or was it some arcane form of behavioral control, which VC Wynne Edwards was advocating? Well, we now know, thanks mainly to the writings of Charlie Krebs, that they're all right and they're all wrong. That there is density dependence in its various forms: delayed, inverse, direct. There is direct environmental control, and the same species even can be affected by all of them at different times or in different parts of their range, and so on. But this was an obsession in the 60s. And then I came across this. Did you realize that most of the big ecology in America in the 1950s and 60s was funded by the nuclear industry? The two Odoms, you probably heard of Odom's Fundamentals of Ecology, the first grand, that was E.P. Odom and his brother H.T. Odom. All their funding in tropical rainforests was to do with how radioactive isotopes of one sort or another moved through ecosystems. Huge experiment in Puerto Rico where they introduced a huge radioactive source in the middle of a forest and traced where all those isotopes went. You'd never get permission to do that now. So this was called radioecology. There were whole books about it. And okay, I suppose occasionally now we do use radioactive traces still. But this was seen in its day as the way forward for especially ecosystem level ecology. And then we got hijacked in the 60s and 70s, but 70s, by ecological energetics, the trophic dynamic approach of Lindemann, which revolved around a couple of bits of equipment. This thing, which is a bomb calorimeter, that's a modern one. They didn't look like that back in the 70s, and respirometers. And the idea was that populations, communities, ecosystems could all be reduced to tracking calories, tracking energy, either through populations or through individuals or through ecosystems. And that was certainly true, and it was also the basis of a thing called the International Biological Program, which was a vast set of projects funded, I don't know who funded it, funded by UNESCO or its predecessors. What emerged at the other end? Well, I'm very biased, but my answer is not very much. We know about energy dispersing in food webs, but it's hijacked in terms of generalizations by what individual species do. It did lead on to simulation modeling because it coincided with the development of and use of computers and access to computers in ecology. You won't believe this, but my thesis in Britain in 1969 was the first to use a major computer for analysis. And for that, I had to go to the Atomic Energy Centre down the road from Oxford and basically tell them what I wanted. They did the whole thing. You as a person weren't allowed near the computer. And indeed, when I went to British Columbia, they actually had an IBM 1130 in an air-conditioned room of its own, which we could actually touch. This was extraordinary. The rest is history. And of course, modeling now of one sort or another has become not so much an end in itself as but something you sort of do on the side, or better still, you get somebody else to do for you. Neutral models, I'm going to jump over stuff now, but there are many neutral models, you all know about that. We've all been hijacked by island biogeography and the Hubble's neutral model, all derivative from Kimura's population genetics neutral model. Important, yes. Explanatory of how ecosystems work? I don't think so, because there's no biology in them, except extinction, invasion, mixing. That's about it. You can disagree. And then finally, molecular ecology, all sorts of stuff. I think this is one of the most exciting things, and we have been, and this is an early paper, well, lots of us, but including myself, where we were using metabarcoding as a parallel way of estimating biodiversity from the old-fashioned way of sorting things out and setting them. It is exciting when you finally get a phylogeny that's trustworthy, these are the butterflies, to be able to trace the origin of certain traits. This is antecedents, but there's a lot of other options there. So what's the point in all of this? Don't get mesmerized by technology. It's easy to do. You can spend a lot of time learning how to do molecular analyses and PCRs and all that sort of stuff. I have done it. Incredibly boring, all that white coat stuff sitting in the lab. But the outcomes are really exciting. But again, they're only useful if you're asking the right ecological, evolutionary, or evo-devo questions. Always think about organisms and focus on biology. I think particularly exciting areas at the moment are trait ecology, molecular defining of food webs. One of my very last students looked at grasshopper diets by doing metabarcoding of gut contents. It's quite tricky with plants. And of course, we all know about microbiota and everybody's obsession with that at the moment. But these are exciting new areas, but they've got to be in addition to the various old techniques. Okay, finally, what am I doing here? Well, I'm here for 2 months. I'm at the moment, I'm in Voita's office until he comes back, I guess, and then I don't know what. The door, or how much time I spent here, I don't know. And the door is, if the door's open, it means I'm available to be visited. As I see it, I was brought here by Voita with 3 tasks. The first is he's working on many things, as you know, but one of the things is on food web recovery following slash and burn agriculture. And he thought it would be useful if I helped to try and develop a general review of post-disturbance succession. I think there are opportunities, not a thing I've ever worked on before, by the way, but that is no hindrance. So we will have a workshop here, which in the 20th to the 22nd of June, very soon, in which a small group of people will get together and try and build one of these sort of template style mental models of effectively ecosystem change, community change, which is succession in the broadest sense. And then we'll try and turn that into a review article afterwards. Anybody particularly interested in that will be absolutely delighted to have you join us. We'll be bringing in a few people from outside, including Professor Thibault from Toulouse, who I think is familiar here, who's a really exciting ecologist and generalist. This is the sort of general decision tree constructed, which is the sort of approach I am talking about. And then each of these boxes down the bottom will turn into another box and arrow diagram, hopefully with modules that can be moved around between these different kinds of succession. And then if the working group agree, we'll try and patch recent work on succession onto this sort of model and see where the omissions are. The second thing is modeled on a task I undertook in Sichuan field station in China a few years ago, and that is to be available for informal discussions with students, postdocs, or whomever. This is a Platonic symposium, but don't think you need to be either male or take your shirt off to come and talk about things. We can do this in small groups. We can do it in individually. But again, my goal in this respect is to get you thinking beyond your projects, as I said in point one. We'll have a session in a couple of weeks' time, is it? In which there won't be a topic. I will interact with you and try and drag out some of your thoughts about the wider world and how your topic fits into them. So come prepared to talk, please. But if you don't like the idea of doing it in a group, just knock on my door. And finally, if there's any time left over, like everybody, I've got things waiting to be finished off. In my case, at the moment, I've partially written articles on my favorite group of moths, the pyraloids, the spilomelines, for people who know what they are. The last field project that we did was on Réunion Island, looking at turnover in an oceanic island in moth assemblages, and sort of related to the succession idea. I'm trying to write a chapter for a book, actually, on this new idea of building microforests in cities as biodiversity stepping stones. There's a lot of international interest in that at the moment, and I think it's an exciting idea. My granddaughter's school in Sydney is currently turning 2 old tennis courts into a microforest, and that's just part of this global movement, if you like, based on ideas of a guy called Miyawaki, a Japanese ecologist. And that's all I have to say for the moment. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
If you have the questions from the audience. Or if you have the questions online, people, you can ask.
Well, that is the whole of ecology over the last 50 years. You must have some questions about it. Why did it happen like that? Partly because people organized funding and convinced funding bodies that particular big picture approaches were a good idea.
Yeah, I actually, as you was mentioning, all these like projects and like approaches in the ecology, it's very funny to come now to the Leipzig forest where you work, because there is a crane and there are the pictures and there is like all these experiments which were like fancy, or they are still fancy, they are all at the same time in the one forest. It's like awesome to see how many people can actually collaborate on some really small patch of the forest with all these things which you just mentioned.
Well, it will always be like that. And I mean, and I don't think any of those approaches are now extinct, but you've got to put them into a context. and concentrate on what's the question that's important. What is common about the impact of predators in a boreal forest in Scandinavia and a rainforest in Borneo, and what's different and why, and the answers won't be simple, but there will be. After all, the mere fact there are predators in both places suggests there's some similarity. This business, there's a big argument in Australia at the moment. We only have one large predator that is native, and that's the dingo, the Australian wolf, which has been in Australia for a maximum of 5,000 years. It is actually introduced. It's not native. There were large marsupial predators, but they disappeared at the time of the sort of extinction of the megafauna. Beyond that, the biggest marsupial predator, even before most of them were wiped out, was about this big. But in those areas that have dingoes, the smaller fauna thrives, is in better condition. Why? Because dingoes happen to like eating cats, and cats have been introduced, especially small cat litters, and foxes, which are smaller, and foxes and cats are both recent introductions. So this business of top predator release, I think they're quite, and it's been argued elsewhere for why, if you don't have tigers, the whole community changes in an Asian rainforest, or if you don't have whatever, jaguars or whatever. So there are common questions. And the whole of Australia is a big natural experiment because of all these wretched introduced animals, which includes the dingo. How long does an animal have to be introduced before it stops being an exotic and becomes a native? Well, it's not a trivial question, especially with dingoes. Dingoes were traded from the north. They were related to Javan dogs, and the indigenous people used them for hunting. Having traded them off Sulawesi traders who used to come into northern Australia for sea cucumbers, bêche de mer. And of course they took over, but at that stage the largest predator was a monitor lizard, which we still have commonly in our garden, a big 2 meter long goannas were there, but there's a different sort of predation. Goannas are mainly scavengers, but dingoes, like all wolves, are pack pursuers of running prey.
I have a question about how what is in your mind? What is the relationship between ecology and evolutionary biology? Yeah, with more and more studies showing rapid evolution. So like interaction of ecology and evolution on very short time scales.
For a long time, ecology was seen by evolutionary biologists as a little bit, because it wasn't dealing with evolution, and any respectable bit of biology, they argued, why wouldn't they? It was their existence, had to be looking at evolutionary questions. I think evolutionary ideas and ecology have now converged substantially. If you think of trait analysis, which is a really sort of sexy idea now, did some nice work with Shuang, who was here for a while. Whose student was Shuang? Was he with you? The woman, Chinese woman. Yeah, and using our moth data from China and looking at the way patterns and colours changed up and down mountainsides and how they, in moths, and there's a lot more work coming along. And she only looked at reflectiveness or colour of formings, but we have a much bigger data set on that now. That's all about, we thought it was all about biogeography, but of course that's also about evolution. And when you start talking about size distributions or color distributions or even changes in life history, antecedents, Lepidoptera using monocots rather than dicots. These are all evolutionary questions, but at the community level, as opposed to the gene frequency level, although I dare say you could get into gene frequencies as well. So that without evolutionary biology, without evolution, there is no biology. Wasn't that Dobzhansky's wonderful statement? Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that's as true of ecology as it is of population genetics. Yeah, sort of.
So they have converged significantly. So like, should they eventually like become one science or not?
Well, ecology has always been across sciences. You know, it's always dealt with when it had to with systematics, certainly with phylogenetics. But some of the questions, like where do you fit, for instance, life history strategies into a phylogeny of the insects, for example, they were in the too hard basket because we really didn't have accurate enough phylogenies. And we still don't for many groups, but we're getting there. I dug out a paper I wrote that was never published 10 years ago, which was looking at carabid beetles, ground beetles, from our surveys in different rainforests from Australia going up into New Guinea. And I was looking at them, paper that's been rejected, you read again, you think, this is actually pretty good, what was the matter? But now you could interpret those results. Before it was basically a biogeographic analysis. How similar were the New Guinea assemblages compared with the ones in far north Queensland, compared with the ones in the subtropics? But now, of course, if you've got a phylogeny of the carabids, then you can actually say, well, this genus did this, and this genus did this, and this genus did this. Although the carabidologists seem to be, there's lots of nice phylogenies of tribes, but I want one of the whole family. I don't think they've quite got to that. They haven't got to the butterfly stage yet.
Olga, yes, or maybe Olga first.
Did you feel during your career the iron veil between Western and Eastern Europe during Cold War as a big obstacle against science and progress and so on, and was with a great change in 1908 for other people, not only us here?
I will back off from that question a little bit because I don't think I know enough about it. I do know, if I may use my own experience, I was fortunate enough in 1969, literally 3 months after I got my PhD, to get a grant from a British Council grant to go to Poland. And at that stage, I was working on water-filled tree holes, which was an aquatic situation. And the best ecosystem level limnologists in Europe were Petrosevitz's group and Maciej Gliwic, who was a PhD student at the time, and other people in Poland. And so going there, but it was a very different approach. But it was, I think I stick my neck out here, but the limnology has always had more of a home on continental Europe than in the English-speaking world, perhaps. So I think there was good exchange between the two. Ecological energetics and the use of bomb calorimeters was a Russian idea. The first bomb calorimeter, I can't remember the guy's name, was the micro bomb calorimeter. There were always big ones, but the one that you could use on individual insects or whatever was a Russian invention. Yeah, I can't remember who it was, but then Philipson in the UK sort of imported it and started the whole idea there. A lot of the IVP projects were done in Eastern Europe. So, but as ecology has become an English language science, nobody would disagree. It didn't start that way. All of the basic literature for my PhD, and there was a lot of it, was in German from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. All of it, with a few frilly bits in French. And you had to read those, and I did endlessly with a dictionary. But we've seen that change, I guess, because of American dominance of science funding over the last 40, 50 years, which is great for we English speakers, but it does mean the rest of you have to struggle with not only the difficulties of science, but reading it in a foreign language. I do apologize, but it wasn't me.
Yeah, on the point where what you were telling like about the history of ecology, from that it very much seems like the, how to say, the reputation or reach of ecology within science has been steadily increasing. We expect this to continue in the future.
Do I expect
that the reputation and reach of ecology within science will keep increasing in the future?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. My hearing is not very good.
Whether the ecology and the science as like part of the science will still be getting more and more important because like within the science.
Well, that's up to us. Clearly, the world is beset by environmental problems, and we won't go into that. And for some reason, some politicians think that ecologists have the answer. After all, ecology is the science of the environment. But I think politically, we have no more answers than anybody else. We might be able to say, we've got to stop emissions, and we can tell you where they're coming from, and we can quantify, you know, the impacts of gas or coal or renewables or mining for lithium or whatever. And there'll always be ecological dimensions there. So I don't think that's going to go away. I mean, about a third of my 30-odd PhD students over the years have gone into industry-related jobs, mainly large-scale environmental consultancies. But whether that has substantial impact on the body politic, I think is another matter altogether. I'll tell you one more story. I was a coordinating lead author in one of the chapters for the IPCC fourth report. That, not the one that's just appeared, but the previous one, which was exciting and interesting and scientific. I was funded by the Australian government to do that because it was the Australian part of the agreement. And with 5 other Australians, we made this writing group with 3 New Zealanders. We worked for 4 years. We produced a really extremely thorough document. Now, we had been appointed by a left-wing government in Australia, as left-wing as we get anyway. But when we submitted the report, it was an extremely right-wing government that denied climate change was even happening. So having spent all that time and all that effort and attended meetings and spent a lot of government money, that report was submitted globally, but it was submitted, our bit of it, to the Australian government. Nothing happened. Like nothing. Not even a request for a workshop or a presentation or a discussion, nothing. The only response I got was a request that we submit our accounts for auditing, you know, how you spent your expenses in the hotels and that sort of stuff. And that's all. And I found that very, very depressing. Fortunately, I now realize that other people other than government read those reports, and there's been more response from industry, would you believe, than there have been from governments. And we just changed government 2 days ago, which is good. So the answer to your question is, I think ecology will remain important, but it's also important. There was a paper a few years ago that said ecology should stop pretending to be a science and should just be a service industry for environmental issues. That would be the end of ecology. I mean, we have to retain an identity as a science or a sub-science, whatever you want to call us. In other words, we have to have a theoretical background. We have to have some projects that are just science for science's sake. It's important to know how Antarctica works. It's important to know how predators work in the Amazon, just because they're there. So this relates to my point one. Remember, there is this thing called ecological science, and you are contributing to it, not just by doing lots and lots of focused projects, but by bringing them together and, you know, reviewing and whatever at a higher level. And that's up to us to do that. And that's the only way ecology will continue to be important, if it's an identifiable block of knowledge. I could go on for hours.